Hi, I'm Elizabeth Roberts. I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan, an associate professor, and I also work very closely with the program in science technology studies at the University of Michigan. STS for me primarily has been a way to break down the division between nature and culture that's been so prominent in the history of anthropology in the United States in the 20th century. And there was really good reasons why this divide between nature and culture grew up that had to do with all kinds of very important work in the United States to try to combat racism. It was saying that there was culture outside of nature allowed anthropologists to talk about human difference in all kinds of important ways at the time. But I think what it did over time is then make it seem like the way we experience the world in our bodies has these two layers, and the more we understand the world, the more it allows us to notice that making this distinction isn't very useful. And so instead of thinking about nature and culture, thinking about method and the way that we arrive at understanding the world through different methods is really powerful, because instead of saying here are the biologists learning about biology and here are the anthropologists learning about culture, we can say here's a phenomenon, say health or inequality, and what are the methods we're going to use in order to know about health and inequality, instead of saying here's the biological truth of it and the cultural truth of it. So my STS research has been really influenced by folks that I would say come out of the feminist STS tradition. It's kind of funny to call it a tradition because not that old. But I think that feminist thinkers, among them many anthropologists, but folks also coming out of history and philosophy of science, we're able to think about how the world is made in really powerful ways quite early on in the body of work that we now call STS. So the folks I'm thinking of, or that have influenced me the most, are people like Donna Haraway, who tried to get us to think about nature cultures together in really important ways. And then Anne-Marie Moll is someone who's very much influenced my thinking, specifically in the work I'm doing now in Mexico, where she has allowed me to think about the coordination of objects like a chemical exposure or a fact created in a questionnaire, or daily life in working class Mexican households, and all the ingredients that go into enacting those things, and the way that we can think about that as practices based in material relationalities, instead of thinking about some of those things as natural and some of those things as cultural, for instance. Another person that has really influenced my thinking is Lorraine Daston's work in terms of the history of objectivity and how objectivity itself has a history and isn't something that exists out there in nature. And then these days, I would say also my work has been really influenced by our very own Kim Fortun, that is part of this event that we're having here. Hannah Landecker, who does really spectacular work on the how biology has history. And Michelle Murphy, who is done, I think, more than so many people to help us understand how phenomena like reproduction are distributed in the world, and how we really can't be looking to individual bodies to understand how different really important biological processes happen. I think there's two things I want to say about that. One is that early on, feminists were able to kind of destabilize any sense of nature as something that is intrinsic and exists over time in all places, because they were able to look around and say, hey, what a woman is, or what a man is, or what sex is something that is very different in different times and places. And feminist thought was the thing that kind of allowed that to happen. Another thing that I probably can't articulate quite as well, but something that I think has been really important as a contribution to STS by feminist thinkers is the focus on care And I think care relations are essential in thinking through how anything comes into being in the world. But I notice a lot that I think folks use care now without noticing that a lot of that theorization came from feminist thinkers who were doing work on care work and all the kind of messy, unpleasant things that care work involves. And so I've been at different kinds of symposiums where different men are talking about, the care of the plants and the care of this, without sort of noticing that a lot of this came out of feminist STS thought and feminist social sciences in general. So I am really interested in interdisciplinary work. Although I sometimes think it might be better not to call the kinds of things we're talking about interdisciplinary and instead maybe talk about multidisciplinary work. And I'm not totally sure I think what I'm about to say, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. I think when we think about interdisciplinary work, we often think about here is a scholar who's kind of combining, say, anthropology and biology and epidemiology and engineering. And there's a sense that the interdisciplinary work is kind of somehow all merged together as if one person can do all of those things. And people doing interdisciplinary work don't really claim that, but I think that model is that somehow we're going to become experts in epidemiology and engineering and anthropology. And the kind of collaborative work I'm doing now feels multidisciplinary because I believe in the value of disciplines in many ways. I'm very much an anthropologist in the work that I do. And I don't think I'm ever going to become an epidemiologist. I'm not going to become an environmental engineer. I'm an anthropologist. And I think in the work that I do that's collaborative, being an anthropologist is really an important contribution. So the kind of collaborative, multidisciplinary work that I'm doing, I call interdisciplinary all the time, is right now, and I think it's going to continue for a while, it's work that I'm doing with people that are conducting a longitudinal birth cohort study in Mexico City, and they've been doing it for 25 years. And our collaboration kind of started slowly. We've been collaborating for 6 years now, and they look at chemical exposure and health outcomes. And since I started working with them, I've been increasingly interested in thinking about both neighborhoods as shaping specific bodies in specific places, and wonderfully for me, many of the researchers in that project in public health are starting to think that could be a really interesting focus. But we're doing a lot of different projects under the banner of this project that I call Mexican Exposures. To me, that's kind of an umbrella for all these sub-projects of how we could do this thing that I call bioethnography, where we're using the methods of biological sampling and the methods of anthropology to make new knowledge about something that you couldn't know much about if you didn't bring these different methods together. And then one of the things that's kind of a sub-project within that, but it's also quite large, is a project called NESMEX. And it's a collaborative project between these same public health scientists and environmental engineers and anthropologists. And what we're interested in is learning much more about how people interact with water in Mexico City, given that the water in many ways is probably safe to drink, but no one trusts it. And we're going to be doing these things called water audits, where all three methods are going to come together in households to learn how water moves into neighborhoods, into households, into bodies, out of households, and out of neighborhoods again, to try to put engineering, anthropology, and epidemiology together to really know what is water and how people live with water and use water in hopefully very complex ways. And then we're going to use that knowledge in this subset of 60 households to then kind of try to scale up and look at all the participants in this study, kind of between 800 and 1,000 participant families. And so we're in the process of trying to figure out how we're going to do that. And it's complicated. Okay, so some of the concepts that have most influenced my work and have helped me develop the concept of bioethnography, Anne-Marie Mall's work on enactment is definitely a big part, and I think that helps me think about what are all the ingredients that go into making something, anything, any kind of phenomenon in the world. But the most specific thing that has affected my trying to develop this kind of research platform that I call bioethnography is Margaret Lock's work on local biologies, which she now calls situated biologies. And she's doing the situated biology things in a little bit more collaborative work with Jörg Neuhauner and Ben-Kim Nguyen. But for me, what local biologies and situated biologies does is allow us to destabilize or make sure that we don't think about bodies as static, and that bodies always exist in a time and place, and what is going to happen in bodies, with bodies, to bodies, is always contingent on political and economic relationships and just a cast of thousands of things that are going into shaping biological processes in really specific ways. And one thing that's kind of tricky about situated biologies is that in the United States, where we tend to essentialize biology, if you start talking about biological difference, you can get into really tricky terrain where you start maybe essentializing racial difference. And I don't want to do that. But I think situated biologies allows us to understand why biological processes are actually different among different groups because of different shared histories over time. And if we think in terms of situated biologies, we don't codify a group as saying it's always going to be that way for them throughout time, but we can look at specific histories and how specific kinds of things came into being for different groups of people. That's a little vague, but I think that what I took from that to do bioethnography or to develop bioethnography is that public health models, exposure models, tend to assume that both chemicals and bodies are kind of static, so you can study the molecule and the body in relation, but all of those relationships are going to be the same no matter where you're studying them. So lead exposure in rural China is going to be the same as lead exposure in urban Mexico. And situated biologies allows us to think about, well, how might lead be different? How might the people who are exposed to the lead be different? And how might the interaction then manifest in a way that's taken up within different political economic contexts that could make the experience of having lead in your body quite different? And so all of those things are not allowed to remain stable, but I think our work is to figure out what are they within those realities, and also to look for the stability of, say, a chemical exposure in a particular reality like urban Mexico City, where I'm working right now. The work I'm thinking of that's actually kind of old, or it's from the early 90s, so it's not that old, is the work that was done by a medical anthropologist, Libet Crandon Mahmoud, who worked in Bolivia, and in highland Bolivia in the Altiplano, and she made an argument about how resources shape why people seek out and use different forms of medical care within a very religiously plural, poor community. And I think not very many other people I encounter have read her work, and I assign it to students all the time, because I think that in some ways she was providing a really early example of how nothing's really stable and how healing and medicine is completely contingent on the resources at hand. So she does a great job of showing why people in a very poor community in the Altiplano in Bolivia wouldn't really necessarily think that biomedicine is actually that stable or useful of a resource to use when you're sick, because, for instance, antibiotics need to be refrigerated and electricity goes off all the time. Or there's no electricity. So why would you count on this thing called biomedicine when there is very little chance that it's going to kind of be stable for you? She also did a great job of talking about how really when people are seeking healing, they want to feel better, but it's also a way to access resources in other ways. And so if you're going to access biomedicine from the Methodist mission, And you're going to get on board with both medicine and forms of religious practice at the same time, and they kind of come as a package, and they allow certain resources, but then they shut down other ones that could be equally important and useful, like hanging out with various kinds of local healers that can give you access to different kinds of resources. And that has always been, for me, a really powerful way of understanding how people heal themselves or seek healing, and how medicine isn't medicine in and of itself. So I think STS can be quite a powerful way to think about power and difference, but I don't think it's always harnessed that way, and I wish it was harnessed that way more. So someone that's influenced me enormously is the writings of Brun Latour. I love reading his work, and I think embedded in his work is, for me, a theory of power and difference. But I don't find that people who take him up all the time really think through power and difference. And so I'll give you an example of that, which is in Science in Action. I have always really been fascinated by the way that he talks about people located in different networks. And he uses an example of, I believe it's like some kind of computer science, I'm forgetting the name he uses, but a computer scientist in Brazil. And then he compares that computer scientist in Brazil to an equivalent scientist somewhere else located in, I can't remember, France or Germany in the United States. And he shows, or he uses this, it's kind of like a parable, because he writes in parables, as how being located in really different networks makes it so that your work can enroll or not enroll different people, depending, I think, through resources, depending on the resources around you, and networks are also resources. And I think that really provides a powerful way to help us understand both scientific knowledge production and how it's differently resourced in different places. And that has a lot to do with networks and resources, but also that coupled with a lot of other STS thinkers like Emery Mall, or someone that I'm really interested in is the work of Vanessa Agar-Jones right now, who works in Martinique, helps us see that reality is totally distributed quite differently, and that then creates power differentials that continue, that just intensify, that amplify themselves over time. And I also think that if we think about resources and networks, we might notice that a lot of people's everyday life in poorly resourced places, or places that don't have access to resources, people's everyday life show them that all the relationships that make objects in the world actually, those people kind of know that. And that's a big insight of STS, but it doesn't really take you that long to learn that theoretical approach if things don't really come together in your reality in the way that it does, say, in, I don't know, France or Germany or the United States. When I think about where STS is headed, I think it has been potentially heading this way for a while, but I would like to head there more. One of the things I'm really proud of about STS at the University of Michigan is I think it's a really it's a place that STS is kind of inherently non-Eurocentric. And many departments in the United States are very Eurocentric in their approach to STS. So it's about thinking about technical and scientific and medical projects in places where people don't worry too much about having resources come together. And I mean, the work that's been done is amazing and wonderful, but I really think when you start having people that are doing STS that are coming from differently resourced realities, the analysis becomes more and more powerful about the construction of reality. Like, we can really see that, or people can see that, who are not based in places where things come together that easily. So I think there's been kind of a post-colonial technoscience studies or post-colonial STS in work for a while. There's great scholars that are doing this. Banu Subramanian is someone that's really involved in that. I think Kim Tallbear is another person. I like to think the work I'm doing hopefully is located in that. And I feel like it is happening more and more, but still kind of the default of science technology studies tends to be about studying how this science and technology, the endeavors of science and technology kind of play out in places that are very well resourced. I think there's some other really interesting directions towards the way that disability studies and science technology studies can really be brought together in fascinating ways. And I like to think another direction in science technology studies is what I think I'm doing. I don't know how many people are on board with it, but I think that for the most part, science technology studies has been social scientists studying how scientists do science. And I think it's really useful to use the tools of science technology studies to actually be part of collaborative knowledge production endeavors about the world around us. So what I'm trying to do in bioethnography in this project in Mexico is to actually figure out ways to make better knowledge about health and inequality using the tools of science technology studies and working with scientists to, like I said, make better knowledge, make better numbers, once we're thinking about all of the relations that go into producing those numbers. I think that there's a lot of potential because in the United States, at least, the academic job market is pretty horrible. And I think it's even harder in a place like Ecuador. Science technology studies, like many interdisciplinary kind of endeavors, I think allows people to think about how to make connections across disciplines, either in an interdisciplinary way or maybe a multidisciplinary way. But I think some kind of training in STS could allow for scholars or people who are trained in it to have very practical skills for bringing together complex projects and helping understand really knotty problems. And I think for me, it feels kind of useful in this project I'm doing about water, where I think I have some tools that some of the other people involved in the project don't have for knowing that there are going to be problems when we bring disciplines together. And I can't anticipate what the problems are, but I know that when we have tension, it's probably not because one of us is a bad person or because some other discipline is like, less interesting than my own. It's that we have incredibly distinct forms of knowing the world and incredibly distinct methods for knowing the world, and that there's always going to be tensions and problems in that. But what it means is that instead of getting really frustrated by logistical snafus or tensions, I can see it as part of the method and the theory of what it means to do collaboration in STS. And that, I think, helps me feel a lot calmer when we run into all kinds of difficulties about trying to do multidisciplinary work. So it's a very practical kind of approach to thinking about things. And the theory and the practice is very merged.